privilege to introduce the second keynote of the day. And our next speaker is someone that I'm going to start by just reading a bit of his background, and then I'll share with you just a few of my thoughts. So Chris Inglis had a distinguished career across the US military and government, including serving as the country's first national cyber director and as deputy director of the National Security Agency, NSA. Prior to stepping down as national cyber director, he led work on President Joe Biden's national cybersecurity strategy. Chris have received numerous awards for his service, including the President's National Security Medal, the US Air Force Distinguished Service Medal, and the Presidential Rank Award for Distinguished Service on 2 occasions. So if that was not enough, here's what I will say from my own experience. I am very lucky in the journey that we had with Sempris that I was exposed and introduced to a lot of people that have accomplished amazing things across their careers. And I think Chris is one of those people where, I don't know if it's more humble, more knowledgeable, or I don't know, just more experienced with things. And having him speak is always an amazing opportunity. And I hope that you will get the opportunity to appreciate as much as I did. Thank you.
Thanks. Across all those things, I must have been happy once. I can't recall when that was. Let me put that in context. There was a moment in my career when I was serving as a brigadier general in the Air Force assigned to the Air National Guard, loving life. I was flying airplanes at the time and doing all sorts of things that the Air Force does. And I had a full-time job at the National Security Agency, and I was appointed as the deputy director. And a lawyer stood up at that point, as lawyers are wont to do, to say, you're having too much fun. You can't do both of these things. You have to actually stop doing one of these things. Both of these are key and essential positions. And so I said, well, let me think. And they said, no, we've chosen for you. The world will be a safer place if you never fly an airplane again. It was a sad moment for me. So I went through the retirement ceremony at the base, which in the Air Force, you have your last flight. They have an instructor with you to make sure you don't do something stupid like fly under a bridge. When it's done, you break a bottle of champagne over the nose of the airplane and hose you down with a fire truck. And I had my kids with me. And there was a 12-year-old at the time who is kind of one of my children. And he's not 12 anymore, but he's still my child. At any rate, so he turns to me halfway through this and he goes, what's going on? I said, I'm retiring. And this visceral fear wells up in his face. And he goes, what are we going to do? I said, oh, no. I said, this is actually a part-time responsibility. My full-time job is at the National Security Agency. And he said, that's a job? I said, yeah, of course it is. And he goes, well, what do you do for them? And I thought, teaching moment. So I explained to him what the deputy director, the chief operating officer, the senior civilian of the National Security Agency does in glowing but unclassified terms, somewhat generic terms. And when it was all done with that description of what that person does, he goes, you don't do anything? Right? Which was, I think, the capstone of my career. So I'm at a loss as to what I'm going to talk about today, since I've just arrived from Washington, and a number of people that I've engaged today have said, can you explain what's going on in Washington? And I'll just take that off the table, which I can't. But I will observe what I think the implications of that are, what the election that just took place. And I'm not going to go into the small p politics corner, but I will talk about the trends that kind of surround us and what that means for those of us in the room, most of us in the room, who have to defend the digital infrastructure that underpins health, life, safety, business viability. Because that's really why we do what we do. We don't defend IT for its own sake. We're actually defending the functions that are dependent upon that. So I will speak to that in a moment. But I'd like to start with an anecdote and perhaps a more general strategic framework, and then go to that corner. And I think we've got enough time for questions. I think I only have 2 hours. It's actually 50 minutes. The next thing I think on your agenda is a party, which I've seen the room. It looks fantastic. But I'll leave some time for questions, and I'm happy to go into any corner you want to go into. Nothing is off the table. But I might not have the wisdom to tell you kind of answers to some of the questions you would ask, but let's go there anyway. So here's the anecdote I would start with. And some of you might have heard me say this, one of my favorite anecdotes, but I think it works in so many ways in this moment in time. There's a CEO. Let's imagine that there's a CEO walking through her cafeteria one day and sees somebody sitting off in the corner that's got a tag on that says CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. Never having met this person, that's somewhat typical in some organizations, walks over and says, I understand that you defend cyber. Can't even pronounce the word, for goodness sake. So how are we doing in cyber? And the CISO, being a little bit intimidated, having this one moment in the sun, responds in a word, good. The CEO, now emboldened, says, wow, that's terrific. How about in 2 words? How are we doing in 2 words? 2 words, not good, right? Now, turns out that both of those answers pertain at this moment in time, no matter kind of where you are in this society or the set of societies that's represented in this room. So every reason in the world to think that things are going well. In a word, good, right? Cyberspace, digital infrastructure for all the companies represented here, allows you to do the work that you do in ways that nothing short of that could. You can reach markets that you can't get to in a physical day. You can manage resources you can't actually speak to in a single moment or in a single venue. There's just all sorts of reasons why the coordination, the synchronization, the deployment of your authorities and capabilities by, with, and through cyberspace is a hugely good thing. And the things that we do that life, health, safety depend upon the resilience, the robustness, the execution of that space in a way that we hope that the answer to the question of how's it going is good. But there are any number of reasons why we should then consider the alternative, which is that we're in a not good place. There are all sorts of threats stalking that space, whether it's criminal actors, which tend to predominate in terms of the number, or nation states like China, which see the private sector as a proxy for holding nation states at risk, and therefore now holding critical infrastructure at risk. Now, there's a whole set of not good propositions associated with those threats, and the inherent frailty of digital infrastructure, which is really hard to make perfectly secure. I will argue we can make it defensible and actually defend it, which is a human proposition, but there are reasons for us to think, maybe I need to get up in the morning and kind of focus on the doom and gloom in the room, not good. The reason I kind of portray those 2 alternatives, present and future, is to say, kind of in a word, that they're not fated. They're not something that we're going to be inflicted with. They're choices. We can choose to go down the road that says we will make this thing work for us, or we can choose, often through complacency or poor choices, to go down the road where this thing has a not good future. But make no mistake, this is not something that just happens. These are intentional choices. The choices you make actually determine whether you go down path A or path B. Even in a world where this infrastructure is incredibly fragile, where the composition of it through all these heterogeneous parts is such that it's almost impossible to make it such that it's perfect, it's secure. It's still hard to defend it. Even in that world, you can go down the good road if you make the choices necessary to make the investments such that it meets your expectations. Now, I'm on the Navy Science Board, where we do a number of studies on behalf of the United States Navy. I don't know what their budget is, but it's probably something in the range of $300 billion or more. And the Navy has the same challenges that you do, which is it's fundamentally, existentially dependent upon digital infrastructure. It knows that. It understands that adversaries, present and future, understand that dependence and would hold it at risk. It understands that it therefore has an obligation to mitigate that. And the Navy, like so many of the organizations represented here, struggles with the idea of, is this a domain of interest all by itself, such that we need to give cyber or cybersecurity a priority of its own sort? Or is this something that is fundamentally and atomically attached to something more important? I would argue it's the latter. Because most of the talks that I give in this space, I start with a question that Jeff Moss often asks in his space. He's the guy that started Black Hat and DEF CON. And the question that he would use at this moment in time to start this discussion is, does anyone in the room know why race cars have bigger brakes? Now, I see some people looking at their watches thinking, how much longer are we going to have to endure this? I thought this was a cyber talk. It is. But the answer to that question of why race cars have bigger brakes is they have bigger brakes so they can go faster. That's it. It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. And the insight that is derived from asking and answering that question is this. It's not about the brakes. It's about the performance of the car. If you want that car to go fast, if you want it to have the performance that you want that car to have, then you do care about the brakes by extension as a consequence of the performance that you're after. I, for my part, would never give a priority to cybersecurity, or for that matter, a priority to cyber, or for that matter, a priority to digital infrastructure. I would say I want to give a priority to the functions, the missions, the business objectives that we have, and then invest in everything that it takes to do that. That way, cyber comes along for the ride. Digital infrastructure comes along for the ride. It's not a cheap trick. It's the reality of how we should think about this. So let's not give priority to cyber, because it only matters, it's only important if the things that depend on it are important. I want to follow my grandchildren online. I want to do banking online. I want to reach markets that I can't get to in a physical day online. Those are the priorities that then drive the investments I'm willing to make. And to be clear, the investments that we need to be able to make, if we get that why part right, are not just in technology. We'll talk a little bit about that technology in a moment, but they're in what I would describe as kind of the triad. There are three things, three assets that organizations that do a good job of defending their viability by, with, and through cyberspace, there are three investments that they make. There is an investment, to be sure, to be made in digital infrastructure and the features and kind of attributes of that digital infrastructure. But there are two other kind of assets that they invest in order to actually be best in class, or at least kind of as a peer of best in class. The second is expertise. They invest in the expertise of the people who build, operate, deploy, defend that space, and importantly, in the expertise of the people who simply use that space. I mean, we train our users not to click on links that they shouldn't click on, right? So we actually make sure that people know what the opportunities, challenges, risks are in that space, so that they actually, through their choices, implicate a good future, not a not good future. But the third and perhaps most esoteric kind of issue of what we should invest in is what I used to call in my national security career doctrine. That's a fancy word for roles, responsibilities, the assignment of expectations. Who's accountable for what? Do we actually have some sense of who is accountable for building that resilience in, sustaining that resilience, defending that resilience? And who's the ultimate accountable party if the business viability isn't actually in a good place? I'll give you kind of a short look into the destination where I'm going. If the answer to that third question of who's the accountable party, if that business resilience, business viability is not there, if the answer to that question is the IT people, that company is heading for a crash. Because most of the risks are taken by the people that actually conceive, aspire, kind of allocate business propositions to that digital infrastructure, or to people, or to markets, or to kind of the capital that's at your disposal. They typically are what we would call the folks on the operational side. And ultimately, the accountable party would be the board or the CEO of that company. You can't silo this and put this in a corner to say it's a commodity that we'll just let the IT guys take care of. To be sure, they're essential to the proposition, but they have to actually have the witting and the willing contributions made by the folks that are running the business to say the viability of the digital infrastructure is as important as the selection of the next CEO. It's as important as selecting what markets we're going to be in. It's as important as understanding what our capital flows are going to be. It's essential to the business. Let's talk a little bit about that doctrine. Semperis recently did a study, a really interesting study, two components of that study. I'll talk about the second, which actually interviewed 900 companies across a fairly geographically diverse set of functionally diverse industries. And the results of that were striking. Most of you probably have access to this, soon will have access to the final report. But one of the questions asked was, how many times have you been the subject of a cyber attack? When do those cyber attacks take place? The vast majority were subject to a cyber attack, no surprise in that. Maybe a small surprise is the vast majority of those cyber attacks occurs on holidays and weekends. So kind of the odd holiday and Saturday and Sunday in some countries, Friday and Saturday in others. Now that shouldn't be surprising. If you think about the attackers, they're going to try to say, look, I'm going to figure out when it is you're distracted or perhaps focused on something else, and I'll come at you then. What's more surprising is the question asked in this study was, so if you know that most of these attacks, 72% I think, and 86% of ransomware attacks take place on holidays and weekends, what's your level of manning in the security relevant portions of your SOC on holidays and weekends? Vast majority of respondents said, well, we take it down because it's a holiday, it's a weekend for God's sake. And in some cases, a very small percentage, in some cases, we take the SOC down altogether. Now, they've not taken the attack surface down, they've just taken the SOC down. It's counterintuitive that at the very moment that you would say that the threat goes up because the aggressors, the bad actors know that that's when you're going to be distracted, you actually play the fool and you allow yourself to be distracted. That's a choice. That is a conscious choice that says, hey, I want to actually go down the not good path. It might be a choice that's not made. It's essentially, it's the result of complacency or not thinking through the second and third order consequences. But I think those choices are more reflective of why we're in some difficult straits than perhaps the rise of cyber threat on the part of criminal actors or rogue nations. I take nothing away from the possibility that we could impose consequences on them where we rein them in. But we need to first think about whether we've done the due diligence necessary to make a defensible proposition, strongly, stoutly defend that, such that what then is left is a smaller problem of finding and imposing consequences on the adversaries. So I think if we're to get this right, we need to think our way through what's our technology play, what's our expertise, and what sort of doctrine, what sort of assignment of roles, responsibilities do we have. Now there is one thing more, and to kind of perhaps describe that, I'd like to actually draw from the experience that we have observed, and some of us in the room have actively assisted, which is the Ukrainians defending themselves against the onslaught of the Russians, not just in the physical space, but in cyberspace. And if you look at what the Ukrainians have done in defending, right, their digital infrastructure, not because it's important, but because the functions of the nation in defending themselves on a battlefield or conducting their national security business or conducting an economy, because that's important, they've invested what's necessary to defend their digital infrastructure. And they've done three things. The first is they invested enough to make a defensible architecture, invested enough in the technology such that that architecture could be defended. Now it is not, when you take a hard look at the Ukrainian digital infrastructure, what you'd want to go to war with. It might be what I described kind of coarsely as a dog's breakfast. Like, you know, today's bagel, yesterday's eggs, a down payment on tomorrow's yogurt. It is essentially built in a way that you've taken minimal assets and invested them in segmentation, you know, some perhaps cloud-based services. So when an on-prem data center goes down, you back into the cloud, so on and so forth. Second thing they've invested in is expertise. Now, many of you know that the Chinese kind of national security component that does cyber operations is increasingly doing something called living off the land. I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool technologist anymore, but what I understand that to mean is that the adversary proposes that I'm going to move into your space, into your home, and I'm going to use your tools, I'm going to use my knowledge of your environment to essentially outwit you in your environment. I'm going to know your architecture better than you know your architecture, and I'm going to beat you by essentially living inside of that, kind of living off the land. The Russians might perhaps propose the same thing to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have said, it's not going to work here. We're going to know our architecture. We're going to have the expertise to know our architecture better than you know our architecture. You can't beat us on our home field. But the third thing, and the war-winning thing that the Ukrainians have done, is to build a coalition. And that coalition essentially proposes to the Russians, or for that matter, any other bad actor, you've got to beat all of us to beat one of us. If you come at me, if you want to beat the Ukrainians or the Ukrainian society, you have to beat me, you have to beat Sempris, you have to beat ESET, you have to beat Microsoft, you have to beat Amazon Web Services, Elon Musk when he'll loan his Starlink terminals to you on the given day, that's a joke, right? But you have to beat all of that in order to beat the one thing you want to beat, which is me. That's doctrine. The second part is expertise, the first part is technology, and I would do it in that order. I would get the doctrine right, I'd get the expertise right, and I'd get the technology right. Now we talk a lot, kind of at Sempris, about what the core asset inside of cyberspace is. Identity is, I think, a good candidate for that role. Why? Because the identity inside cyberspace is the embodiment of your privileges, it's the embodiment of you in that space. And so goes the privileges according to that identity, so goes the function of that digital infrastructure. And if somebody can steal that or hold that at risk, then anything you care about in physical space goes along with it. And the fact that, I think in that study that we did across those 900 customers, there are companies today, enterprises today, that make no meaningful investment in the defensive identity or the Active Directory that represents that. That actually represents a set of choices that say either by complacency or by conscious choice, we're going down the not good road. Right? That's all I'll say about those things, but perhaps one thing more. The life of any organization or nation state can roughly be kind of construed as having 4 phases. You'd like to live in the first phase that I'll describe, but most of us probably live in phases 2, 3, and 4. What are those phases? First phase is what I call peace and tranquility, right? We're about to have some of that this evening when we go to the kind of the venue next door. There'll be peace, tranquility, possibly a little bit of chaos, maybe a lot of drinking, but that'll be a happy place, a happy time. And we like to live there most of the time. The second phase is an emergency phase where things aren't going the way that you would expect. You're trending towards that not good kind of leg of the possibilities that I talked about. And in order to address that, you essentially have to surge. You kind of take your rheostat of the resources that you can control, whether that's people, whether that's the manning of your SOC, whether that's kind of the expertise that is kind of under the roof. Work longer hours, work harder, work with greater intensity to control the situation. Third phase is a crisis, where you get to a place where the resources you own and control can no longer surge sufficient to handle that situation. You have to actually engage in augmentation. You got to call somebody in, you've got to actually kind of pick up the phone, call in some first responders, maybe they're public service, private service, but you've got a list, hopefully, where you say, I need some additional resources, maybe some additional commodities, maybe some additional warm bodies, but bring those in so that as I move from emergency to crisis, I can stem this thing, I can stop the slide down that slope. Because you want to avoid, like the plague, the fourth phase, which is disaster, where permanent harm ensues. Now, the reason I describe that is to say organizations that have thought their way through all 4 of those phases before they leave the first phase, before they get out of peace and tranquility, they tend to do well in those crises because they understand what they're going to do when they turn their rheostat up in the emergency phase. They know who they're going to call when they have to go to the augmentation in that crisis phase. They've actually got those pre-established relationships. They've got all of that set in place to say, I know what glass I'm going to break so that I pull that phone, make that call, and they're going to show up because they know me in advance. They're part of a coalition. Coalition that might not be active every day, but they're part of a coalition that's on call, that they can call to say, hey, look, as this crisis rises, whether they're dealing with nature or an active threat, criminal or nation state, that can make the case, you got to beat all of us to beat one of us. And the all of us that I'm talking about, we all know who we are before the crisis begins. If you've not done that work to essentially create that augmentation strategy, if you don't know what you're going to do with the crisis, when you reach for a phone book at that moment in time, I teach at the U.S. Air Force Academy, when I use the term phone book, there are kids Googling that, trying to figure out what the hell a phone book is. I hope you know what I mean. And if you're reaching for the phone book at that point in time, it's already too late. So I would say you got to get your technology in order, you got to get your expertise in order, you got to get your doctrine in order, and you got to get your team in order. If you do those 4 things, you're in a good place. So I'd like to go to questions, but let me just say a little bit about what some people asked me to address, and I'm woefully inadequate to address, which is to explain what just happened in the American national election. I can't, any more than any of you can. But let me talk about what I think the consequences are. The consequences are that the oncoming administration is going to kind of follow through on their promises. They're going to do several things. One is they're going to have an emphasis on deregulation. Now, that might be a very good thing for some of us in the room. I think for purposes of the Securities Exchange Commission imposing consequences on publicly traded companies who now today have to report a cyber material incident within 4 days, my bet, I don't know, and I have inside, my bet is that goes away. Right? So that might be good news for us. But as a consequence, your expectations that the supply chains you depend on, that the commodity provisioning of software and hardware is going to have a regulatory imposition imposed on them to essentially deliver to you defensible material, whether it's hardware, software, I think the prospect of that is reduced. Because the reduction in kind of an expectation that they will serve the supply chain with things that can be defended I think under the future administration, that will be reduced to somewhat. We'll go back, right, to what essentially ruled the internet for the last 50 years, which is that innovation, market efficiency, very strong drivers kind of our way forward, hugely good things. But safety, which has been the third leg under that stool, which has always been the weakest part of the triad, in some cases not something we specifically addressed until we got to the operations at the end of the supply chain. I think that's going to be weak once again. What does that mean for us? You might be relieved that the pressure from the SEC is going to be relieved, but you should be thinking through what then is going to be the imposed responsibility on you if you can have a reduced expectation of inherent resilience and robustness, and perhaps a reduced expectation of material support from the government. And I, having been a creature of government for so long, I would add, if the government was ever helpful in the first place. I don't mean it that way. But what I mean is if you think the government is going to come to your rescue under the next administration, I think the reduction of government resources, assets, and the distractions going to occur is going to be more imposed on you. You are going to have to think through, what's my reliance on digital infrastructure? How do I get that in the right place? How do I get my expertise in the right place? How do I get my roles, responsibilities in the right place? And how do I become a member of a larger kind of coalition? Thinking through those choices so that you intentionally choose to go down the good path and not the not good path. And to be clear, the not good path is a matter of choice. If its choice is not made, so be it, but it's a matter of choice, not fate. I think also we're going to find that in a future administration, that there'll be an emphasis on industries that perhaps are not at the forefront now. So those of you who are supporting oil and gas, that's probably coming back more strongly. Those of you who are investing in the finance sector, I think that there'll be a there'll be a reduction in the regulation today that has stopped some of the mergers and the kind of the acquisition strategies. So I think there'll be some boom moments for various industries that can be kind of thought to be attendant to the new administration's priorities. And you need to think your way through, am I prepared to not simply defend more of it on my own nickel, but am I also prepared to scale? Because I think scale, business scale, will be something that is incentivized, if not kind of actively aided and abetted in the next administration. So I would, if I was in your shoes, and I am in your shoes, I'm on a couple of public boards, I do advisory work for companies that are both startups and kind of like in their mature phases, I would think through what's about to happen that affects me. Because we're going to have to actually take a lot more local action in order to substitute kind of for what we once hoped would be more strategic or perhaps national action that a benevolent actor, a paternalistic actor would have done on our behalf. I'm not saying that the present administration that's about to lapse would have done a better job, but I know the next administration doesn't intend to stand into that space the way this administration intended to stand into that space. Regulation probably doesn't go away, but it's going to be small r regulation, not capital R regulation. And to the extent that there's a world that you want to actually see the government kind of actively sponsor, or your compatriots in your sector actively sponsor, or perhaps kind of the quasi-government entities like the SEC or the FTC, you should actually be an active proponent for what that looks like, because they'll be looking for advice and counsel and guidance that's not going to be top-down driven the way it might have been under a previous administration. It's going to be somewhat more horizontal than vertical in the future. And if you have a view as to how those things should be cast and how these coalitions should be built, you should be actively kind of serving as a proponent for that. I was once at the White House, and I'll just give you an example, and then we'll go to questions. I was at the White House, and you may know that in the strategy that I was responsible for in 2023, and I say that not by way of taking credit for it, but by saying if you have a problem with it, pin that on me, ask me a question about it. I was the one who essentially said, I think it's ready, let's let it go. But it was the work of 400 stakeholders, 300 of whom were in the private sector. But there was a moment in that where we considered that we want to actually have a top-down directive that says we need to regulate and impose expectations of resiliency on the supply chain so that when the operators get that stuff, whether it's hardware, software, or commodity systems at scale, that it's more defensible. And somebody his company spends $750 million a year on cybersecurity, not IT, but cybersecurity, I'll leave you to guess who that was, showed up without an appointment, kind of at the outer office of my office in the West Wing. The secretary came in and said, there's somebody waiting to see you, but he doesn't have an appointment. So what's his name? She told me what the name was. I said, he has an appointment. right? And he came in and he asked me a really kind of fixating question. He says, do you know what's critical in the financial sector? And I had to think, kind of under the direct glare of that questioner, I had to think for a moment whether I was going to kind of like be completely candid and say, no, I don't, or whether I was going to try to give perhaps some kind of on-the-fly ad hoc answer. I chose the former. So I don't. I know that we need to balance payments. I know what the role of liquidity is. I know all of those those somewhat kind of simple phrases, but I couldn't tell you precisely what I'd put my finger on to regulate in order to get this right. He said, that's right. He says, I know that. And there's no shame in that. You don't have a life in the finance sector. Your life has been mostly at the National Security Agency, the White House, places like that. He said, but if you were to pursue automobile safety, my bet is that without the advice and counsel of people who build automobiles, you'd be focused on the tailpipe of the car in pursuit of safety when you really should be focused on the brakes or the air safety bags or the seatbelts. The point being is you need my help in order to get this right. The government's probably not going to ask you in the next iteration about what your opinions are in that regard. It's probably going to be somewhat diffused, somewhat perhaps local initiatives on the part of federal agencies and departments, even if it's sustained at all. You need to take the initiative to go to them, tell them, kind of be a proponent for them before they actually regulate the tailpipe in pursuit of automobile safety. That's my best advice going forward. We're only, 5 days into this. I have no idea what comes next. I've been watching the cabinet appointments in a state of wonder. Leave you to guess as to which wonder I'm talking about. But it's going to be an amazing 4 years, which puts more burden, more responsibility on us. Think about your dependence on digital infrastructure. Think about what choices you are going to intentionally make about investing in the resilience of that, the expertise that supports that, ultimately the assignment of roles, responsibilities, expectations about that, and become part of a coalition such that when somebody tries to take you on, they need to take all of us on. This room's a pretty good start. It's an excellent start of that coalition. So those are my opening remarks. I think we've got 18 to 20 minutes for questions. I'm happy to take questions on any and all topics. I'm about to go to the Air Force Academy where I teach. That's what I'm going to do later tonight. I'm going to spend the entirety of tomorrow with 17 to 21-year-olds. They're going to ask me the same questions. So I'd rather test those on you before I actually test them on these formative, young, agile, kind of nubile minds. So who's first?
Hands up.
Sir, you can just ask the question. I'll change it to what I want and answer it then.
Hi. We just had a session right before regarding cybersecurity and operational resilience. And I think you were talking about something that was pretty interesting, was a story around SOC, you know, how attacks happen probably on the weekends or things like that. And I just wanted to push it a little further. So let's just imagine we have 24/7 SOC running for all of our industries, right? And real responders and, you know, everybody working. If they see something happening, let's say privilege escalation, lateral movement, or something going on, do they actually have enough privilege or enough knowledge to implement countermeasures, or do they have to rely on another party like, I don't know, the identity experts or things like that?
That's a great question. So I'd first ask whether, and this is a rhetorical question, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but are we talking about a security watch center or a security ops center?
Yeah, so security operations.
Operations center. So it has the authority to stand in and actually interdict, engage, right, an active threat. A watch center just kind of watches, right? So very interesting, great story. It's going to be a great story to tell my kids when they get home tonight. But what you want is an ops center. Now that ops center, if it's a weekend or a holiday, and I get that there are overtime rates and perhaps reasons why you want to actually balance the workload across the population that mans that, maybe you want to take the staff down a little bit because you're not going to have as many user inquiries because they're all taking the holiday. But you need to figure out what's the mix of technology and expertise and surge capacity, those three things, to actually sustain ourselves across this holiday or this weekend, recognizing that the attacks across those 900 respondents are going to be up 72%, or 72% of the attacks will occur on those few days. That's the way to say that. If you understand that, and you do, of course, then you kind of make your necessary investments. The surge part is perhaps the most interesting part. That's what you've asked about, which is when something happens, are the people and the technology I have at my disposal sufficient to handle that problem? Well, it depends, right? If you're kind of still living in peace and tranquility, tis but a scratch. If you remember the Monty Python movie, it's just a small thing, just kind of whack it and then kind of go on, because there's a Super Bowl game being played. The best place to watch those is op centers. Oh, that was my inner voice. Anyway, so if it's a small thing, no big deal. But you have to imagine the possibility that you have a stout adversary. They know that the weekends and holidays are when you're distracted. They're going to kind of sally forth, and they might drive you into an emergency. They might drive you into a crisis. And if you get to the emergency, how do you surge? Do you know how you surge at that point in time? Are the people on that watch shift authorized to use certain tools, or perhaps to operate kind of in longer hours? You get to determine that. And you need to imagine the low probability, or maybe moderate probability, high consequence of a crisis. So who are you going to call, right? If you get to the crisis, you have to augment your staff. If you know that in advance, you're in a good place. You've done as well. You're in a best practice place, right? Technology can, in fact, substitute for people to some degree. But at the end of the day, people are the accountable part. So it's best to think about the meld of technology and people. So I'd be happy to have your answer.
The answer is perfect, but there was a follow-up on that one.
Oh, okay, good.
So the first one was watch versus ops. We often get that because people don't realize the difference. So they say they have a SOC, but it's more like a watch center.
Right, right.
The second part is then when we play these scenarios with, let's say, the board, different industries, they often don't understand all the underlining things, as you were saying, tech. So let's say SOC sees something going wrong. They want to make a change, but it might have a huge impact on business. Hundreds of millions, probably of dollars, whatever. They want validation, but it's nighttime. So they have to call somebody up. And what we did is we measured that. It was for a bank. So by the time they got an identity expert that was on call, because they don't work 24/7, that was another half hour. And by the time that he could log into his workstation, do whatever, he still needed management to validate it. So basically, from the moment that they detected it, we were running over 2 hours before somebody could actually perform an operation. And as you know, since you were giving great stats earlier on, 2 hours is probably...
It's an eternity, right? Company's dead.
Company's dead.
Right,
yep.
Right. Yeah, so let me give you an anecdote and then come back to the question you've asked. I was on a board once, and what I'm about to say is nonsensical, but imagine you're on the board, right? CISO comes into this board and says, I know I only see you like once every 6 years. I only have 15 minutes. So I'm going to make this really quick. I need $5 million to do two-factor authentication to prevent cross-site scripting. Now, the technologists in the room would say that's nonsensical. That doesn't make any sense. But that's what the board heard, right? And the board at that point, the guy said, does anybody have any questions? And the only question that anyone on the board could ask was, does that door still work? Because I need to leave. I need to go. There's a very important phone call. I don't know where it's coming from, but I'm going to go take it, right? Now, the problem in that was that the person who was actually making the request was speaking through the lens of their experience and the things that mattered in the world that they lived in. They had no idea what was the language of the board and what made the board's heart swell to 3 times their normal size. After some counseling, that person came in the next day and said, hey, I know we do business in some dodgy places where there are people who pretend to be who they are not, pretend to have access to resources they do not. There's a particular place on the map, maybe it's Yemen, and we want to do in our business plan, $10 million of business there next year. If you give me $2 million, I'll guarantee that every person who shows up is who they claim to be and the resources that they say that they have access to, that they in fact have those resources. Now, the details on my side is I'm going to double down on identification and authentication. I'm going to use certain schemes to do that, but I put it in your language, and I want to know from you whether you're serious about our business plan. If you have that discussion, then the board is going to say, where the hell have you been? My God, lock that door, let's stay in here for the next hour. Right, now, I'm being cartoonish in that a little bit, but I think the question you've asked is a really important one, because oftentimes the two parties, the board or maybe the ops side and the IT side, are speaking through the lens of their own experience, speaking about their local terms of reference, and speaking past one another. If we on the IT side, and I spent most of my life on IT, cyber, cryptologic sides of the table, if we on our side say, hey, I know the common language of this organization, are the aspirations that are articulated in our strategy or our business plan or our business objectives, start there, talk about those, say that's what hangs in the balance. I need your permission to expend resources to achieve that. Then you get to the second part, which is what can I do before I call you? Because if I call you and we then have to go into a discussion, time is wasting. The initiative doesn't stop on the aggressor side. they're going to use our failure to act in a timely way to hold us at further risk. They're going to keep driving and pushing on that attack surface. So you need to have some discussion in advance to say, do I understand what my authorities are? Do I have the authority to defend the business plan? How far can I go in defending our business plan? Can I, in fact, do what's necessary within whatever envelope that might be? And I'll call you when I get to the edge of that envelope. I'll call you when I'm starting to actually do something that is perhaps a bridge too far. If you have that discussion, then you're going to have the full faith, or at least partial faith and confidence of the board and the ops team. And then you'll be able to do what you need to do without entering into a basic discussion about identity is spelled I-D-E-N-T-I-F-Y. What it means, all of that is, you cannot do that at that moment in time. And I would tell you that companies that actually have that discussion, where the ops folks say, yeah, you're authorized to do the following things in order to defend our business, they actually can do well in these moments in time. You may get to a place where there's a surprise on the part of the board, the CEO, the line leadership of, I didn't realize that this was the kind of risk we were talking about. Those are best borne out, and I know we're doing some of those here in TTXs. Right? Have an actual exercise, and nobody gets a pass. Nobody gets to take the day off, right? The CEO, the COO, the line leaders, they all have to be at the table. So then when you get to that ugly moment where the business is in crisis because this digital infrastructure we're relying on actually has some frailties and has active opponents. There are people that are actually trying to take us down. If they work through that, they will never have enough experience to actually know what exactly the script is of the next cyber breach. But they'll have the muscle memory, the knowledge, and the trust in the people that are in the SOC to say, you have my authority to actually navigate that territory. I think that's where you need to be. Anything more than that in terms of me saying this is the script to do it, I'd be lying to you and saying that you can prearrange all of this stuff. But it's the language that you speak, it's the kind of muscle memory you have, and the authority you have to be an ops center as opposed to a watch center that is going to be the thing that's tested at the moment in time when the breach occurs. I just tell you, look, we're about 12 years? 11 years after the arrival of Edward Snowden. Anybody know who Edward Snowden is? If there's somebody in the room who does not know who Edward Snowden is, raise your hand, I will come back and hug you. But when Edward Snowden came out, that was for all practical purposes a breach, right? A massive breach, right? And I would say that he had more to say about allegations than he had revelations. But nonetheless, we had a moment in time where we had to actually staunch the flow and address that at speed. And the things that actually worked in our favor, where we actually knew our system better, right, than Edward Snowden knew the system. And so every time we kind of had a challenge of what are we going to do about that, we didn't have to pull the books and figure out what we knew it. We knew it cold. We had a coalition, right, that helped us essentially kind of staunch that flow and actually make the case that we were in the right place doing the right thing. If we'd attempted to build that coalition on the fly, if we hadn't had that coalition in place, I would not be standing before you today. I'd probably be kind of, selling kind of used Dodge automobiles, in some foreign country. But we had the muscle memory, we had the coalition, and we responded at speed, and we had the authority to do that. That's perhaps an extrapolation of an extraordinary sort into that corner. But I've lived this dream where you have to figure out what am I authorized to do on the fly. And if you don't have that permission in advance, you need to have the trust from people that they're going to let you kind of like exceed your boundaries a little bit. And then you kind of can say, I'm sorry later, but it won't be some violation of trust that you took upon yourself to do something that you were never authorized to do. Next question.
So, Chris, you talked about coalition. You've used the term a few times, so stronger together. What's your view of the new administration and the impact on the Five Eyes? It was fabulous to see co-authored paper on Active Directory security recently. Do you think that's going to diminish under the new administration?
Yeah, so thanks for that. That's a weedsy question that actually kind of makes my heart swell with 3 times its normal size. So I just say most of my life was spent in the presence of what we call the Five Eyes Coalition. I spent better part of 30 years at the National Security Agency, and even when I was in the White House for 2 years, Five Eyes was a coalition I could always depend upon. Now, there's a much larger coalition of nations that essentially align their national security interest. I would include Israel strongly in that crowd. Most of the European nations, Scandinavian nations, Japan, I'd put them in that crowd. But Five Eyes for that purpose is something that goes back to the 1940 timeframe, when the United States and the United Kingdom, they formed something called BRUSA, British USA, that ultimately became UKUSA, UK USA, ultimately became the Five Eyes. And what was remarkable about that then, and is remarkable about it today, is that they shared without precondition. They had what I would call a professional intimacy. They didn't ask each other questions as if they were playing the game of Go Fish. They essentially said, hey, look, I don't know whether this information is useful to you, but here it is. Here's an anomaly that I can see. It's a hunch or a shred or a shard of information in my space. I don't know what to make of it. Maybe you can. And all of a sudden what happened in the Five Eyes relationship in the early days, and it's been this way ever since, is that somebody else in that room, that Five Eyes room, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, Great Britain, now United Kingdom, will say, well, the other half of that thing is on my side. I know exactly what that is. It's the thing that actually makes sense of the shard on my side. What's miraculous about that is it's not kind of sharing at the highest possible level. It's sharing in collaboration at the lowest possible level, where actually hunches are formed, synapses fire, discovery between two or more parties is possible because they're collaborating in a way that no one party could discover that by themselves. Now, how many of us kind of in our day-to-day businesses have that kind of collaboration, not division of effort or not deconfliction with some other party? The kind of professional intimacy I think is required to actually kind of crack the cyber defense nut is that Five Eyes kind of collaboration, as opposed to what traditionally is a division of effort is, let's play Go Fish. Do you have any information on X? No. Do you have any information on Y? No. Meanwhile, you're sitting on Z, which is profoundly important to the organization that asks the question. But because I've not asked the right question, we've actually not cracked the nut. We're not actually collaborating. We need to realize, as the Five Eyes did, we're not trying to solve similar problems. We're trying to solve the same problem. And the half of it that you see might be the other half of what I see. And so I think that kind of coalition is what I'm arguing for. Now, that's hard to do with the US government, because sometimes when you offer information to the US government or other governments of interest, they use that information to find and stab the wounded. I know that, right? But increasingly, if the government or governments plural want to be truly helpful, they need to use their benevolent powers to essentially say, hey, look, I'm going to give you information that is actionable, but it's only actionable if I give it to you because you're the actor. You might remember about 2 years ago when Microsoft said in the first 6 months of the Ukrainian crisis, we kind of detected this possibility of a wiper virus that has the following shape and form that had not yet actually kind of entered the landscape, but we've detected what that might look like. We've devised a patch, deployed that patch to 300 million endpoints, problem solved. Now most people say, well, good, that's what you should do. Now the really thoughtful of those said, how the hell did Microsoft know that? They're not authorized to go behind some Russian firewall and understand that the Russian government has devised that wiper virus and is about to deploy that across the Ukrainian kind of cyber mass. Turns out there are organizations that are authorized to do that, to know that. Having then found actionable information, if they share that without precondition with a various set of parties, I don't know what to make of this. It could be something that you can make something of. Might be that that's what happened. That's the kind of collaboration, coalition that I'm talking about. And the Five Eyes has done that richly and well for 80 years. Other nations are also participating in similar activities across the coalition of nations. I'd be bereft if I didn't repeat again that Israel, Europe, kind of Japan, South Korea, they're all in that as well. Question for us is whether the private sector and the public sector can achieve that degree of a relationship when at least the Constitution of the United States imagined that we would never do that. The Constitution says there's a division of effort between the private and the public sector. They go their separate ways. In the realm of cyber, because we're solving the same problem, not similar problems, I think we need to take those walls down and figure out how do we actually have some degree of professional intimacy without holding proprietary or private information at risk. Is that the question you asked? So great. I think we have time for one more.
Hands up. Come on. Hey, good evening. I just want to know what are some of the obstacles that you faced in enforcing the national cybersecurity laws, and also how was your office working with the various infrastructure sectors to making sure that their systems were up to date?
Yeah, great question. Let Let me go back to when I was the US National Cyber Director, a position that was not on top of a vertical, but perhaps a coach in a horizontal, which is the way we thought about that role. That position was a facilitator, a coach of a larger team that was wider than it was tall. You'll never subordinate the private sector to the public sector. That's just not going to happen. Not in this country, probably not in many other countries. So we had to figure out, how do we actually create this sense of a team? How do we make that team real in the coalition fashion that we kind of discussed earlier? And that was perhaps the hardest thing. What I found hard inside of that was this, what I used to describe as proactive ambivalence. That's a fancy term. What does that mean? I was once asked, what keeps me awake at night? And it says, not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the ransomware actors, it's us. That there are any number of us that would say, this is a problem. There's a smoking kind of thing somewhere in the room, maybe in a closet, that we would call cyber threats, or the lack of cyber resilience, or a lack of confidence in digital infrastructure. And then many people would say, and I hope to goodness somebody solves that problem. I hope somebody's going to do something about this, not realizing that all of us have a role to play, right? And so that's a huge issue. How do you get the time and attention of the board? How do you get the time and attention of the CEO? How do you get the time and attention of all the stakeholders? Because the IT specialists, the cyber specialists, cannot impose this on them. They really don't know what the aspirations of the business are unless they study the business plan. They really don't know what risks are being taken by the operators until they first recognize that perhaps some adversary is taking advantage of that practice. And so that proactive ambivalence, that complacency, is perhaps the toughest problem. Creating then a sense of a team, right, kind of based upon kind of removing that complacency and understanding we have common aspirations, common challenges. That's perhaps the second greatest problem. I might tie it for first. And then downstream of that is, how do we make the necessary investments in technology and expertise, right, and coalition building? The Ukrainians have shown us that's not that expensive. It's just not that expensive, right? Now, they might have an existential threat facing them. They clearly do. And therefore, they're motivated to get that exactly right. But this really isn't about resource. This is about commitment. This is about the coalition that occurs between and amongst the players on that field. Let me just close by saying one thing about, kind of an obvious but not well understood fact. If you look at the competitions now taking place between various societies in the world, right? You might say that the United States and a coalition that it's part of is one kind of way of approaching the world. Free and open societies based upon free and open architectures. Chinese have a different formula. The Russians have a different formula, somewhat more autocratic. And by some kind of definitions, the Chinese are kind of moving into first place. Maybe not by the basic economic proposition, but when you look at innovation, in 44 technology groups that were assessed by something called the Australian Strategy Policy Institute, ASPI. But in 44 technology groups, material science, advanced microprocessor fabrication, generative AI, the Chinese are in first place in 37 of them. When you look at peer-reviewed research of who's doing it, who's actually publishing it, who's coming up with the next new and novel thing, Chinese are in first place in 37 of the 44. And yet, the American economy is still chugging along, doing quite well. And something that doesn't show up in that study at all, which actually tracks the first place, second place, third place, all the way through fifth place of every one of those 44 technology groups, Israel never shows up. 0.12% of the world's population never shows up in that study of who's doing the innovative breakthrough research. And yet, Israel's responsible for about 20% of the market play in terms of cyber innovation, both defense and offense. Why is that? Culture matters. Right? The relationship between the parties in that society matters. And it's a fundamentally different relationship than what an autocratic society, a top-down driven society, can develop and deliver. Advantage, us. We're still in the winning seat here if we actually understand the richness and the value of coalitions and build them and deploy them, understanding we're solving the same problem, not similar problems. And we essentially say to our adversaries, you got to beat all of us to beat one of us. And we're going to know our game better than you could ever know our game. You get inside of us, we're still going to beat you because we know what to defend, how to defend it, and we do it very, very well. Doesn't cost a lot of money. It does cost a lot of time and attention. And if we give the time and attention, we can choose the good path as opposed to the not good path. Thanks very much for your time. I think there's a party awaiting us. I wish you all the very best in that. Thanks.